Extraterrestrials have been visiting this planet for thousands of years. Thankfully, influencers and podcasters like Joe Rogan and even the mainstream media are starting to talk more about what's going on in our skies and on our planet. We're about to take a look at some important moments from the Joe Rogan experience involving aliens. But first, like and subscribe. You've heard of Roswell, but have you heard of Brazil's Roswell? It's even creepier than the American story.
I was watching this documentary today. It's a new James Fox documentary about a UFO landing in Brazil in 1996. Holy, it's incredible. I had no idea that there's this city called Varginha, and in 1996, according to everyone who was there, according to medical records of people who were there, the military came in, they recovered a crashed UFO. And there was living creatures that people came in contact with, and one of them was this tiny little thing that this guy carried, and he carried it to wherever they were gonna examine it. When he carried it, he got whatever was on its skin. It had like a slippery kind of skin. It got into his body and infected him, and he wound up with this horrible general infection, and he wound up dying. His body shut down, his immune system shut down. His body didn't know what the to do with this alien thing that he was interacting with. There's real records of this guy contacting this thing, grabbing it, carrying it in. All these people witnessed it, and then this guy winds up with this insane infection shortly thereafterwards. That's all documented too, all of his medical records.
Archaeologists are lying to you. That's right, it's not just the government and its politicians. The archaeologists are doing it too. We're about to find out what was really going on back in ancient Egypt.
Like, what's the wildest speculation as to how these things were made?
Well, I'm pretty convinced that there was there's obviously saws and tube drills that are powered by something. Now, I think it may not just be pure friction. There might be ultrasonics involved. One of the whole interesting things I like about this space is it's like, and this has to do with even like the energy stuff that Randall was talking about, that he's coming to talk about as well. There are realms of science that sit outside of our understanding. We'll know more tomorrow, in 10 years, in 1,000 years about science. So I think when we look at some of these things in the past, we should be open-minded enough to consider the possibility that some of the answers may sit outside of our current perspective, because our tendency is to look at it all and try and how would we do it?
Right.
How would
does
our
anybody
technology
have
solve this?
wild speculation that you've entertained?
Yeah, I think there's, so one of the topics that often gets mentioned here is like ultrasonic drilling. So having it resonate at a frequency that matches the native frequency of the rock and sort of separating the rock more easily. And that's a technology that we're developing. Like, we do some ultrasonic drilling like this today with jewelry and stuff, and you literally vibrate, you find the correct vibration, you can put like a little star-shaped bit through a stone. They do it in like small work. I've seen lots of examples. And if you turn off the machine, it's like Excalibur stuck in the stone. You can't get that thing out. Like, you need that vibration to go through it. Plasma, you can even go as far as, well, they were softening the stone somehow with some molecular technology. Speculation like that. I would also say that some of these examples of technology and machining extend way up to these massive objects. Like, you have 1,000-ton single-piece objects that also exhibit some of these signs of precision engineering. So you might be talking about some truly giant machines that made them. Giant columns and statues and things like that.
And what do conventional archaeologists say when they're confronted by all of this data? The pottery, the vases, this stuff that you're looking at here. What do they say?
Well, you either just get a denial and they won't address it, and you get dismissed as just being ridiculous pseudo archaeology fantasy theory type thing, or in the case of the tube drills, for example, they will. And it's a funny story because they will argue that no, it's not spiral. The grooves on that thing aren't spiral, and in fact, in the textbook, this is what Chris Dunn found out. In the textbook where they do try to address the engineering with that tube drill, they took the photo of the tube drill and they just tilted it, just a little bit. So when you look at it on the page, the lines look horizontal. It's literally in the textbook.
They fucked with it in the textbook?
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
They altered the photo because if you admit that tube has a spiral groove on it, now you're admitting that they're cutting into that granite at a ridiculous rate, and you can't do any of that stuff with any of the primitive tools. It has this flow-on effect that just knocks over this house of cards that says all this stuff was built with primitive technology, and our whole concept of the ancient Egyptians is off. Now, I don't think it's. I think the dynastic Egyptians, they used primitive tools. I think they just inherited a lot of stuff that's potentially a lot older. You know, and the proofs in the puddings with these vases, for example, that stuff, those things disappear from dynastic Egypt after the 3rd, 4th dynasty. They don't make them anymore. They make alabaster vases.
Is that a tool?
What
is that?
That's a fantastic example of what I would call an out-of-place artifact. It's a hollow tube of lapis lazuli, which, by the way, there's no quarries for lapis in Egypt. The closest one's probably in Afghanistan. Came from Gebel, found in a pre-dynastic site. It's hollowed. It's perfectly made. This is a very difficult thing to achieve, even with modern machinery. And it's displayed in a cabinet next to what? Bone and beads. Right?
And what is that? What is that supposed to be? That tube?
It's something decorative, I assume. It has a gold sheath, but it's a hollow tube. I actually have pictures of it from the end on, not probably in the ones you have, Jamie, but yeah, hollow tube. It's an out-of-place artifact. These things from hard stone, and these are more examples. Rock crystal, obsidian gourds and vases that show just perfect, just very high degrees of sophistication.
You should mention the
pre-dynastic.
The statue faces and the symmetry. How can you possibly do that by hand? This will wow you.
Yeah. So there's a whole category of aspects to the discussion around ancient technology, right? And I have to be kind of careful about what you say, oh, it is or it isn't, because in reality, we really haven't analyzed that many artifacts. This vase work that we've done, first one we've actually taken a look at. That core, that's the first one and the only one that's really been analyzed. So I characterize something that's beyond the capabilities of these primitive ancient civilizations as being, okay, machining marks, tool marks, like these giant circular saws, tube drills, precision, and there's elements to precision, and one of those is symmetry. And there's been some interesting studies done on the faces of giant statues. One in particular is the face of Ramses. There's a statue at Luxor. They've since put the head back up. It's up now 30 feet in the air on top of the statue, but it used to be on the ground. And again, Chris Dunn was real seminal in this. He went and took a photo, bang on, very front on, and then what he did was you take a copy of that photo, you make it 50% transparent, make the original 50% transparent, you take one and you flip it on that horizontal axis, then you overlay them, right? So you would see the left to right, it's like overlaying the left side on the right side, and it's perfect. It's this face here, but I wonder if you can find the picture of Chris Dunn. That's actually
There's your video right there.
Video's there as well, where I get into it.
Website, but it's not that picture you're asking for.
No, it's similar, but it shows other aspects of, the same radius of tool being used to cut. But what's interesting about the symmetry, it's perfectly symmetrical, left to right. Now, this isn't a feature in humans. No human is perfectly symmetrical, different nostrils, different eyeballs. It's also not something that is done in artwork. So, people often say, well, Michelangelo, he carved David. It's a beautiful statue. I've seen it. It's incredible, but it's human. It's not symmetrical. Symmetrical is, you can't achieve that degree of symmetry just by eyeballing it and doing it by hand. And it's also something that's not really human. I think some of these statues almost look a bit inhuman because of that symmetry when they're up there and they're staring at you, because it's mind-blowing to actually go and look at them. But it's the other aspect is the most efficient way to create that would be to say, well, if you were going to design it in a computer, it's like, well, I'm going to create half this face in a program and map it out, and then I'm just going to reverse it and say, well, that's the other half. It's literally the most efficient way to do it, and that's kind of what we're seeing in some of these statues.
Go back to that image, please.
It's virtual perfection.
And what's the explanation for this that modern archaeologists use?
They did it by hand, right?
They do it by hand. That's literally what they say. You just don't. They're not engineers and construction experts at the end of the day. That's the problem. So it's very difficult to engage them on those specific details.
Former National Reconnaissance Officer, representative of Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Task Force at the U.S. Department of Defense, recently testified in front of Congress that we, yes, the Americans, have live biologics. We have their bodies. This next clip is long before that testimony occurred, but the truth is coming out.
I have had people that work at Area 51 confirm parts of Bob's story. One in particular saw him coming off the jet, or he says he saw him coming off the Janet flights. I said, will you go on record with me that you met Bob there on the tarmac? No. Why? Everything we did there was confidential. We couldn't even tell our wives. Why would I go on record with you?
And if he did go on record, he'd probably get harassed or arrested or...
Yeah, he can't even tell you what he ate for lunch out there. You know, that so, and one of the guys I was real excited to talk with just recently passed away. He actually started the bar that was at Area 51. So everybody told the bartender stuff. He started as a flower fund because no one would send flowers to wives when people died out there. But my point is, people have come forward to George, to me. A lot of people are lying, but it adds up over time, man.
I got more than 24 people who have come to me with bits and pieces of the story, who had worked out at Area 51 that I confirmed were out there. Security people who had seen a disc under a tarp in a hangar. Different people had worked there at different times, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, who had little pieces of the story, not to confirm Bob. And then there was one that I pursued. I don't know if you want to keep going on this,
Yeah,
but I had pursued this guy. I was trying to find in the early 90s people who were in a position to know about what goes on out there, and I found one. And he had been active in the nuclear weapons program. He had worked for EG&G. He had EG&G had the contract to manage Area 51 from the beginning, all the way through the first 30 or 40 years of it. And so I started basically stalking the guy. One of his sons was a state senator, and he had told me, he confided to me, that you got to ask my dad about UFOs and aliens. And another son had been an FBI agent. So I stalked the guy, introduced myself. There were a couple of public events where I would just show up, and he finally got confident enough in me to invite me to his home. And he gets out these scrapbooks, and he's showing me these stories and clippings and photos from the nuclear weapons program. And I'm watching and taking notes and stuff, and suddenly he closes the book and he goes, "You're not here to talk about this nuclear weapons, are you?" I said, "No, not really." And his wife walks in and she says, "Oh, you're not going to tell him that stuff, are you?" And then he started telling me. And then over the course of 2 years, I would meet with him, have a cup of coffee somewhere. I couldn't take notes. I couldn't record anything, but he told me the story. Now, this guy actually is someone that you've had reference to on your show. Remember Annie Jacobson, her book about Area 51?
Yeah.
Well, it's the same guy, but the story that he told me was different than what he told her. He said that they eventually told me that they had a live alien out there, that I could not go public with this until after he died, that they had craft, that it was in a special spot. Originally was at Indian Springs, which is now Creech Air Force Base, and then it was moved to Area 51 when 51 became active. And then there was a very small group that tried to analyze this stuff. They didn't know where it was from. They didn't know how we obtained it. He said this thing was alive, and that they eventually were able to communicate with us, and told me that he was going to make a videotape and he was going to make it available so that after he died, I could have it. Well, suddenly, 2 or 3 years later, he totally changes his story. What had happened was there was a congressional investigator. His name was Richard D'Amato, and he worked for Senator Robert Byrd, and he oversaw black budget projects. And he got onto this UFO story from Whitley Strieber. And so he was assigned, find out what the deal is. So he went around the country, talked to different researchers, and came to me and wanted to know about Area 51 and Lazar. So I told him a story, and I told him about this guy. And he got permission for this guy to violate his security oaths and talk to him about it. And they had multiple conversations, and they went to the founders of EG&G, the company, and it became a dead end. But after that congressional inquiry, this guy completely changed his tune. So he made up this story, which is the one that you heard from Andy Jacobson, that what crashed at Roswell was a Russian technology, Nazi technology, flown by the Russians, containing little concentration camp victims who'd been experimented on by Dr. Mengele. Completely ridiculous, story. But I think he got scared. He was a real guy in a real position to know, and had shared with his family some of this information. I think the story that he told me was legit. But if he made the tape, which I think he did, I didn't get it.
How much time has been wasted talking about bullshit in this subject?
Centuries. Centuries.
That's part of the problem, isn't it?
People just make shit up.
Yeah.
And the more fanciful and ridiculous, the better. Unfortunately, people pay more to hear that and consume it.
I had an operation one time after the Lazar thing, somebody who was targeting me, and he had other people helping him that could convince me that he had worked out there with live aliens. And I'm getting letters from his, supposedly written by his neighbors. Hey, you got to check this guy out, Dr. I'll just say X. He was taken away by armed security in the middle of the night. I think he has something to do with aliens. And from out of the blue, then suddenly I am at a planetarium event, and I'm going to speak about UFOs at some event at this community college. And the guy shows up in a men's room. Hey, my name is Dr. X. Standing there at the urinal. You're not doing a story about me, are you? So no, who are you? What? This was a concerted effort to get me to believe that he had worked out there. And it went on for a couple of years. And of course, it was complete bullshit. When I finally did dig into his background, I was able to document where he had worked and what he'd been doing through most of his life. And it was just like a fantasy role-playing thing. At least I hope it was.
What do you think about all this? I'm sick and tired of the truth being kept from not just the American people, but from the world. It's time we all open our eyes. Thanks for watching Alien Secrets Revealed.